Hey Fish Fam, I don't know if you guys are like me and get way too much junk mail, but today we're going to look at how you can convert all of this crap into some free fish food if you've got some larger fish. You're going to need some kind of composting worm that is palatable to fish. I like to get their fishing worms from Walmart. You can get them at a couple bait stores. These are eisenia hortensis, which are the European earthworm. European nightcrawler, I'm sorry. But any of the red worm composting worms should work fine for this. The only thing that you really need to be careful of when you're doing earthworm stuff is they tend to be really hard to eat, so you need to be okay cutting them into pieces for your fish. Even cichlids with pretty strong jaws have a hard time taking a full-size worm and making a meal out of it in a reasonable amount of time without getting frustrated. But if you cut it into thirds or so, they're usually alright. The European nightcrawler lays about 1 egg per adult per week. So you're not going to get explosive numbers of these, but if you're using them as supplemental feeding and not your primary food source, they work pretty well as a self-sustaining thing. I'm going to start with 2 of these jars, which is about 60 worms, and I'm just going to be adding more as I go. They will be laying eggs, the babies will be growing up in what I'm making here today, so I will be getting extra worms out of this. It gives me something to do with the junk mail, and it gives you a pretty rich fertilizer out of it also. If you're somebody that likes to do gardening, you just run it over the winter and you'll get really, really nice compost come spring out of your junk mail. So there's 2 ways that you can set this up. I use a straight cut shredder. I use this one here. The link for this is down in the description. I got it on Amazon. It's an Amazon branded thing. It's getting pretty hard to get straight cut shredders anymore. Everything does crisscross security cuts. You don't want to use that. It packs together a little bit too tightly and the worms really can't do anything with it. But if you don't have a shredder, when you go through your junk, any of the shiny plasticky stuff you don't want to use. But anything that's just printed on paper, it's perfectly fine. See what this is. What a deal. 25% interest. Anyways, if you don't have a shredder, you can just take these and tear some straight strips out of it. They don't even have to be exceedingly thin. This is perfectly fine. So you're going to tear everything up and you're going to put it into some kind of container. You can see it's just a regular plastic tub. I've got just a whole bunch of junk shredded in here. This is, I don't know, a week of junk mail. This is something that you will have to add to as you go. As the paper breaks down, the worms will eat the paper, they'll eat the bacteria growing on the paper, and it will get smaller. So you want to add to this with some regularity. The more worms you have, the faster it's going to happen. You can add food scraps to these, but I don't recommend it. When I have tried that, worms, even when you have a lot of them, tend to eat pretty slowly, and that's fine if you have an outdoor compost pile, but when you've got something like this inside with a lid on it, anytime that you have fruits or vegetables or anything, it really just turns into a fruit fly breeding ground. And you come down and you find out that there's just 60,000 fruit fly larvae crawling around in the thing, and that's gross. And if you just use the paper, your worms will be fine. They will process it just fine, but you won't have a mass of fruit flies mucking up your house and generally being annoying. I did have some previous footage of what this will look like in about 6 months, but I went ahead and used that bin for the garden that we planted. I used it as part of the mix-in for our roses, worms and all, because I wanted to make sure that the soil would stay aerated, and somehow I lost the footage of that. So you're just going to take my word for it that this works pretty well. Next thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to wet this down, because this is dry, and if we put the worms in here, they're just going to die immediately. It's going to desiccate them and they're going to die. So you don't need anything special. Tap water is fine. Normally, so this is something that's good to use a sprayer on. I don't really want to spend the time. So I just pour some in, and mix it up so that everything is reasonably damp. You can see the color change here when it gets wet. And whatever you use, you want to make sure that you have a lid that you can keep some of the moisture in. When you're using paper, and only paper, you don't have to worry so much about putting a drain in the bottom of your container. You're not going to end up with pooling and puddling like you would if you're adding watermelon and things like that to it. So it doesn't take a whole lot of water. You can see here this is pretty soggy. And what I'm going to go ahead and do, because this is shrunk to about half the size, is I'm going to do up another couple bins of shredding to put in here so that I can fill this up before I add my worms, and I'll be back once that's done.
1 hour later.
Okay, so I've got the full bin done. All I'm going to do with the worms is just dump them in, cover the box up, and stick it in the corner in the dark. It's just going to go underneath a table off in the corner that I've got one of my big tanks on. They do pretty well in this kind of setup. You will have to come in and check the moisture pretty regularly. You want it so that it sticks together when you squeeze, but not so that a huge amount of water comes out. So you want to feel wet, but not be runny. This is what I have the best luck with. If you live someplace really dry like I do, sometimes it's necessary to add a little bit of coconut fiber or peat moss or something to this, just to keep the moisture up. But usually, as long as I keep adding paper, it does perfectly alright. I come in about once a week, and I just spray it with a little bit of water on top, and that's enough to keep everybody happy.
12 seconds later.
You can see most of them have already crawled into the paper at this point. You know, it's really that simple. This is something that is a pretty easy DIY food source for people. If you've got smaller fish, these are still kind of useful to do. What I'll do is I'll let them grow out, and I'll pull out a lot of the extras, I'll sun dry them, and then once they're dry, you can get something like a magic bullet blender that you're not really going to use for food. You can powder them, and you can use them pretty well for DIY food sources. These are a very good nutrient source for most of your fish. The various worms have different nutrition. The best ones are probably going to be Canadian night crawlers, but any of them are pretty good. They tend to be way better than things like bloodworms. Even the worst earthworms tend to be pretty good sources of food. They have a really good lipid balance, so they are nutritionally better than using something like shrimp or raw fish chunks or things like that, if you've got fish that will accept them. They take about 20 weeks to reach adulthood, about this size, so you can't count on getting a massive amount of them immediately, but again, if you start with something like 300 of them, you know, that's about $30 of worms. You'll end up with a colony that you never really have to add to again, unless you're breeding, selling, you know, medium-sized Jack Dempseys or Dovai or something like that. And that's it. It's an easy project. They're easy to care for. They don't need anything special. Just remember to give them some more paper once in a while. You know, at least in the US, there's a constant flood of that crap coming in. So it gives you something to do with it other than just filling up the landfill. We'll see you guys next time.